First, a little test. I'd like to ask you please to concentrate on the central image in this slide. It is not very visible, but you can probably have this little exercise with me and try to identify what you see in this image. For post-structural semiotics, we would say that I would encourage you to lexicalize what you perceive in this image. Your answers to this exercise are probably very various, but if I flip the image upside down, then we are all probably going to reach a consensus. It's going to be very hard for you not to identify the profile of a bearded man, of a bearded old man in this cloud. So the point is that when you flip the image upside down again, well, again, it is going to be impossible for you not to recognize the same visage in the image that I first presented to you with the first orientation. So this means that in the first image, there wasn't a general consensus. You could not all recognize the profile of a bearded man. In the second image that had the right orientation, you were compelled to recognize this profile of a bearded man. And if we return to the first image with the same orientation, then there too, you are compelled to find the same image with the same lexicalization, profile of a bearded man in the upside down image as well. So this is a common phenomenon in the perception of faces, which is called Paraidolia. It is interesting to us from many points of view. First of all, because it tells us that there is something in this plastic structure, the plastic structure that underpins this image, that compels us to recognize a figurative element. There is a certain disposition of the drops of water that pushes us to see the profile of a visage. So it is interesting to ask whether this element that compels us to recognize a visage is a cultural element or is a natural element. The answer is probably that it is both. It is a natural element because there is a mechanism, cognitive mechanism in our brain that compels us to recognize a face in this visual configuration. But at the same time, it is a cultural element as well, because we do not only recognize a face, we recognize a bearded face, and probably we recognize, or we might recognize in this plastic configuration, the profile of a deity, of a divinity, of a god. This image was taken by a photographer working for BBC, and it was then combined with a text entitled "Neptune seems to have made an appearance on the East Sussex coast during a storm." The sighting of the face of the Roman god of water was captured by BBC photographer Jeff Povers in New Haven on Tuesday. He took the picture as waves crashed over the harbor wall during the storm. The sighting seems to be an example of pareidolia, when an image is seen in an otherwise random or ambiguous visual pattern. Mr. Overs said he took the photo at about 9 BST at high tide in winds of more than 50 mph, 80 kilometers per hour. It's become a popular location for photographers because the sea boils in high wind against the sea wall. The waves splash into the high wind and when blown back occasionally make caverns that look like pareidolic Gaulish faces. Where is the cultural element? Well, if the photographer had been a Chinese photographer depicting or taking photographs of the gigantic river waves that hit the estuary of Shanghai, probably he wouldn't have recognized the same deity, he wouldn't have recognized the beard, but he would have probably recognized the face. So there is a combination here of something in our brain that pushes us to recognize the face, and something in our culture, in our memory, in our language that pushes us to attribute further connotations to this face. So it is interesting to combine the point of view of cognitive sciences, the neurophysiology of vision, but also cultural semiotics, with the physics of the waves, in particular a phenomenon called dispersion, which is very important at the center of the modeling of the so-called raw waves. Dispersion is the mechanism where a system decomposes into simpler systems, each of which moves in a different way, and the overall effect is to render the system decoherent. All the while, energy is being conserved and the dynamic is time reversible. Yet this often leads to the system simplifying over long periods of time. This is different from dissipation, amplification, and friction. The physics and mathematics of dispersion has been applied to the study of several natural phenomena, among which waves, and in particular rock waves, that is, unusually large, unpredictable, and suddenly appearing surface waves. Rock waves are currently object of active research, and evidence is accumulating that they can appear in any medium, including in liquid helium, in quantum mechanics, in nonlinear optics, and in microwave cavities, in Bose-Einstein condensation, in heat and diffusion, and in finance. So dispersion might actually be a central dynamic in order to understand how complex configurations might emerge from random interactions. Including these complex configurations that visually emerge in visual pareidolia. So this is another example of religious pareidolia. Is the Jesus face, is the face of Jesus appearing on a toast. And this toast in particular was the object of an article published in 2014 by a group of Canadian neuroscientists of Chinese origins, Seeing Jesus in Toast, Neural and Behavioral Correlates of Face Pareidolia, which has actually won the IG Nobel, the Alternative Nobel Prize for Bizarre Research attributed by Harvard University. So what is the main content of this article? This article claims, and it is already an old article published in 2014, that face pareidolia is the illusory perception of non-existent faces, and this illusory perception is actually rooted in the brain, and in particular in an area of the brain which is called the right fusiform face area, which is the area that compels us to recognize faces, even if faces are not there, even if just visual configurations that are similar to faces are in the environment. So I would like to combine this knowledge with another trend in the history of religion, which has been religious sciences, which has been inaugurated by this book by Stuart Guthrie called Faces and the Clouds, a new theory of religion. The theory is that maybe some religious cultures originally were generated by a pareidolic phenomenon. So there was something in the human brain that compelled our ancestors to find visual meaning in random configurations, in configurations that were actually created through physical dispersion. And that was the origin of most anthropomorphic religions, according to Guthrie. Now, there is some evolutionary evidence related to the development of erect position in the ancestors of the Homo sapiens, and in particular in the evolution of human bipedalism, which began in primates about 4 million years ago, or as early as 7 million years ago, with the ancestor of the sapiens called Sahelanthropus, about 12 million years ago with the Nus Guggenmosi. So what is interesting to point out is that this erect position that was first developed by this particular stage of our evolution basically had a series of consequences on the way our ancestors used our head muscles, and in particular the head muscles of the forehead that were not used in order to sustain the head anymore. It wasn't necessary because the posture was almost erect, and they were then adapted to other means, the means of frowning, for instance, the means of communicating. So our face became a sort of a screen for other beings of the same species. This particular stage in the human evolution coincided also with the human possibility to first stare at the sky and at the clouds. Our predecessors before this stage would actually go around like this. But then from this stage on, we could go around like this. So actually look at the sky and look at the clouds. So at the same moment in which we were able, as members of the species, to look at the clouds, we were also able to liberate the face from other functions and to use it as a screen in order to communicate with other beings. And then last stage, sorry. I want to end up with this very recent study, which has just appeared in Frontiers in Synaptic Neuroscience by a group of scholars, published in 2021, a synaptic framework for the persistence of memory engrams. What is an engram? Several studies have demonstrated that the excitability state of a neuron affects its probability to be allocated in an engram network. Furthermore, a transient learning-induced increase in excitability of engram cells is thought to mediate linkage of experiences that occur close in time through co-allocation of engram cells. So this article basically says that if you first do not recognize a face in the cloud because the configuration is upside down, and then I turn the image and you actually recognize the face because the configuration is in the right plastic disposition, then a sort of an engrammatic structure takes place in your brain that is going to be the source for all sort of subsequent memories that will use the same engrammatic structure. So this was a little bit too complex to condense in 20 minutes, but my contention is that semiotics has been interested a lot in the study of grammar, grammatic study. We should probably combine that with an engrammatic study. There is a grammar that takes place in the formation of our memory, that takes place in the constitution of our visual memory, and that ultimately has played a very important role in the progressive structuring of human cultures, including the imagination of divine faces and their role in religion. So this is more than I had expected. Sorry, I talked, I think, for 17 minutes, but I'm very pleased to answer your questions, if any. Thank you very much. So we started at 12:10. I talked for 17 minutes. We have more or less like half an hour for each speaker, isn't it? Yeah. Yes. So we have 13 minutes if you want me to go more in detail on some of these passages, which were very quick, I realize, but I'm ready to interact with you. But I think I should also, as a chair, have a look at the chat. Massimo, I think you need to share the screen. Okay, no, that's okay. So you're welcome to ask questions also through the chat. Sure, I can ask a question to myself, of course. Maybe too easy.
Yeah, thank you, Massimo, for this very interesting presentation, which gives a retrospective retrospective insight into our interest in the basis. I have two questions. Because there is something that governs our perception of the sensitive cultural knowledge, etc. Would you call those legitimes? That's the first question. And the second one, I was wondering whether you think that it would be relevant to have a look at the way newborns interact with the faces. Because you also explained a bit the anthropological development. So I was wondering whether that would be relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. By the way, this is my project in Turin. It's an ERC consolidator grant project that I have the pleasure to lead at the University of Turin. It's called Facets, and it deals with all sorts of questions concerning the face. Most questions are local, concerning digital cultures, representation of faces. But I'm really interested in at this stage about big questions concerning the face and its human development. And I feel the need to combine semiotics with a lot of other disciplines, including neurosciences, including evolutionary biology, and so on and so forth. But I believe that semiotics is probably the most versatile meta language that we can adopt in order to create a bridge between all these knowledge fields and research fields that proceed separately from each other. I mean, scholars who work on the transformation of the use of the forehead in evolutionary biology do not necessarily have a knowledge of how that might have impacted in the social interaction among our ancestors in the past, or those who study the synaptic condensation of memory do not necessarily work on cultural memory, let's say memory outside of the brain. So, to be more precise about your question, all the knowledge that we receive from the semioticians of the past is very precious, and Peirce, for instance. But at the same time, they were producing insights, being completely let's say, ignorant about what came after in terms of developments in knowledge in neurosciences. So their intuitions were very valid in many cases and are still valid. They probably can suggest as a name for some processes that we haven't named yet. But of course, I think the exchange must be mutual. I mean, it is not only necessary to recognize Peirce in modern, let's say, in neurocognitive sciences. It is also necessary to recognize modern neurocognitive sciences in Peirce. So not only give old names to new phenomena, but also to give, let's say, new names to old phenomena. Certainly there is a lot of research about the perception of faces in newborn babies, and even in babies who haven't born yet. There are some experiences of pregnant mothers on the wombs of which a triangular shape made with sounds is projected, so that actually the baby inside, which hasn't born yet, has an impression that this triangular image is forming within the womb of the mother. And it has been seen with twins, for instance, that when one of the twins is exposed to this triangular shape, has a sort of a switch of attention that the other is not, meaning that probably the right fusiform area of the brain that encourages us to direct our gaze immediately toward the face is something that is created even before the baby actually sees the face of the mother.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. And it's kind of the need to have a broader perspective on the phenomenon nowadays. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I was thinking about your proposal, if I understood it correctly, that Paraidolia phase can be sort of the origin of religious belief. And I was thinking, why not patterning more generally? Because in a sense, we are inclined to see patterns everywhere, not only in faces, but we have even areas devoted in our brain devoted to recognize the typographic pattern, for example. So why not simply say that the tendency there was in perceiving the world as not random, as having an organization, and then can organize it in consequence?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very good question, because I mean, if you follow the thesis as it is proposed by this book, God's Faces in the Clouds, then you couldn't take into account the emergence of religious cultures in civilizations that do not actually anthropomorphize deities, that do not actually attribute a face to gods. In most, like many non-anthropomorphic religions, there isn't this attribution of a face to deities. So deities cannot be recognized. But there is something more interesting in that hypothesis, which I would call the Engramatic Hypothesis. It is as if there were some areas of our brains that are specialized in certain pattern recognitions, not all pattern recognitions. And one of them, which has been studied a lot, is exactly the part of the brain that is specialized in face recognition. Now, the hypothesis is that actually that area might have played a significant role in creating, well, in the brain, a sort of an engrammatic structure. So somehow our ability to recognize faces in the environment was the basis in order to structure other memories that were not necessarily memories of faces, but were related to memory of faces. It is as if there was in our brain a hierarchical structure in which some patterns are used in order to create engrammatic networks that then can host a whole bunch of subsequent memories. And the challenge is to try to see whether this is the case not only at a level of the formation of our individual memories, but also in the formation of cultures. I'm not talking about archetypes, because if you go into that direction, then you dig into certain knowledge that was very popular in the 20th century, Jung and other scholars. I'm talking about some evolutionary features of our species that then created a certain disposition toward personal memory and language that then, as a consequence, inflected also the way in which human beings create culture together.